Something sweet. You're not going to have that. Sweet. Trust me, you have to chew and take it.
Sorry, before you start, Gregory, is everything okay in the other rooms?
The day of small nations has long passed away. The day of empires has come. She had a foot in every continent save Antarctica, her flag for every quarter of our globe, and a quarter of the human race kneeled before her. The world's seas and oceans were hers to command. She was Britannia, the symbol of the world's first superpower, the richest state in history, and the first industrialized nation. This was Great Britain, and that was her empire. In the modern world, and especially in Africa, the words colonialism and imperialism are used as pejorative words to describe a system of greed, racism, ignorance, and exploitation. There is no doubt that in some cases, this can definitely be attributed to the British Empire. There is great controversy about empire today, and for many, the British Empire has been vilified. The British Empire indeed had its faults. In some cases, the colonialists were racist and greedy. And like any other nation, she had a dark moment, such as the Indian Rebellion in 1857, which saw the massacre of both British and Indian civilians, and the South African War, which saw the first use of concentration camps by the British. However, despite its faults, no one can deny the fact that the British Empire shaped the modern world and that it had many benefits. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow aspiring historians. Tonight I'll be exploring the idea that British imperialism, despite its faults, had its benefits. The word hegemony is defined as an effort to achieve world domination. No state in history has ever been able to fully reach this goal, but people such as Napoleon and Hitler tried and failed, both as a result of the one nation in history who nearly achieved hegemony. What were the benefits that Britain brought to her empire? Slavery, a system that has been practiced since before the ancient Romans, reached its peak during the late 18th century, with ships sailing from Liverpool and Bristol to transport slaves from Africa to America in the infamous triangular trade. Liverpool became one of the most fast-growing and prosperous cities in Europe, controlling 80% of Britain's slave trade, as well as over 41% of Europe's. By the end of the 14th century, by the end of the 18th century, every maritime nation was involved in the slave trade. Spain and Portugal populated their massive colonies in South America with slaves, and the French colonies in the Caribbean had a constant supply of slave labor. The Industrial Revolution that financed Britain's entrance on the world stage was financed partly by the Liverpudlian slave merchants. Despite the fact that Britain had financially the most to gain from the slave trade, it was British abolitionists like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson who finally ended slavery within the empire. After years of protest in 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, which made the slave trade illegal. And in 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which made any form of slavery illegal. From 1808 to 1860, Britain maintained a Royal Navy squadron off the coast of West Africa at great expense, for the sole purpose of stopping the slave trade. In 1815, Britain paid Portugal £750,000 to stop trading slaves north of the equator, and in 1817, Spain was paid £400,000 to stop trading slaves in the Caribbean. France would abolish slavery in 1848, 26 years after Britain, and the United States would take more than half a century and the Civil War to finally join the British in the abolition of slavery. The scramble for Africa started in 1881, and by the end of it, only Abyssinia and Liberia were not controlled by Europe. For Britain, the goal was to prevent other powers moving in, and to accomplish Cecil John Rhodes' dream of a British African empire stretching from the Cape to Cairo. Many natives, although unhappy with the Union Jack flying overheads, were still grateful that it was indeed the Union Jack, not the harsh black white of Germany, who had of Belgium. King Leopold of Belgium practically owned the whole of the Congo personally, took everything he could from his people that were starving and ravaged. Wilhelm II of Germany allowed the first genocide in history to occur in his colony of Southwest Africa. From 1904 to 1907, the Herero and Namako people were exterminated, placed in concentration camps, and forced to work for slave labour. A large group of the Herero people escaped capture and risked death by crossing the Kalahari Desert in order to reach safety. In Bechuanaland, a British protectorate, only 1,000 survived the desert and German patrols. However, when the 1,000 survivors reached British soil, they were granted immediate asylum. The British Empire builders, unlike Leopold and Kaiser, tried to give something back to the people they ruled. This was sometimes not always achieved, and there will always be some who play up all the wrongs of empire, and often forget what Britain gave to the world. Education, religious freedom, the right of appeal, roads, railways, freedom, and peace. A defining trait of the British people is the idea of exploration, which inspired the great empire builders of the 19th century to go forth to the furthest reaches of the globe and extend the empire. The Spanish Empire ruled the provinces through force and oppression. The British would only use force as a last resort, or when British lives were in danger. The British employed a concept called indirect rule. When the British would arrive, they would use the already existing social order in order to control the country. For many natives, the image of the British was that of a strutting young white man dressed in his khaki safari suit, sporting the inevitable pith helmet, and sometimes brandishing a collapsible flagpole, the symbol of his authority. Existing native chiefs were allowed to control areas. Britain gave her subjects more autonomy than any other nation. Thus, the British Empire would rule by proxy. Egypt, at the end of the 19th century, had its own king, its own flag, its own parliament. Yet, it was the British Consul General who truly had the power. In the 1930s, in British Africa, there were 1,200 civil servants for a population of 43 million people. British rule was paternalism at best, and dictatorship at worst. Another benefit of empire was her power to enforce her own Pax Britannica. The term Pax Romana was used to describe the peace the Roman Empire maintained in the provinces and buffer states. Likewise, it was a Pax Britannica that lasted from the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo on 21st October 1815 and ended with the rape of Belgium on the 4th of August 1914. Therefore, we have the British imperial century. The fact that Britain maintained her greatest power between the two most destructive conflicts of the day is not a coincidence. The idea that a quarter of our globe was at one point united and at peace with each other is astonishing. Although the imperial century had a scattering of wars, such as the Afghan, Crimean, and Boer Wars, the world, and especially the empire, experienced 100 years of relative peace, in which it was usually Britain who imposed it. If you were allied to the British, you could rely on a quarter of the globe to support you. The British Empire had many achievements in her imperial century. However, there are many other accomplishments that we take for granted. The world's most widely spoken language is English. 54 countries around the Anglosphere have English as an official language. Our banking systems originate from Britain, and more than half of the world's democracies use a system based on the Parliament in Westminster. After English as the world's lingua franca, the most obvious and popular benefit that Britain brought is sport. Many of Britain's former colonies love rugby, and we in South Africa are galvanized by the rugby that was brought to Cape Colony in the 1850s. Many also like cricket, a game that is so singularly complicated that it requires one to be British to understand it. Polo, the sport of the upper class, is still played today in Johannesburg. Incidentally, the nickname Joburg was invented by British sailors. The most amusing fact about the many sports that Britain brought is that the mother country is often beaten by her former subjects. Europe ruled the world during the 18th and 19th centuries. Most of the world was exploited for their resources and wealth. The natives of Africa were killed, and their resources were stolen. Imperialism leaves a bad taste in one's mouth because of all of its negative connotations. Perhaps the British imperialism is an example of colonialism at its best, and the Germans and Belgians, colonialism at its worst. All three are lumped together as imperialists in some effect to the memory of the British who died in Asia, Australia, Europe, Africa, and America in the honest pursuit of what they believed to be a force for good, the British Empire. There was a time when men all over the world stood with straighter every time God Save the Queen was sung. Children celebrated the birthday of Queen Victoria every year on the 24th of May, known as Empire Day. People in Canada still loyally carry on celebrating it every year, although it is known as Victoria Day. It's nearly impossible to comprehend the power and majesty that the word empire once meant for the quarter of the globe. In 1892, the poem Vita Lombardo was published, and the second stanza struck me as it encapsulates what the empire meant for the people of Britain and how glorious it seemed to die for one's king and country. The sand of the dead is solemn red with the wreck of the square that broke, the Gatling's jammed and the colonel dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke. The river of death has brimmed its banks, and England's far, and honour a name. But the voice of a schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game.